Hey guys! As some of you may be aware, I just got home from a 5-day, 40-game Scrabble extravaganza held in Charlottesville, Virginia. Now, playing that many games of tournament Scrabble was definitely a bit exhausting, but it was also a ton of fun. As always, I had an absolute blast hanging out with new and old Scrabble friends both on and off the board. And the tournament also went quite well for me. I won the 12-game opening early bird, and I also won the 21-game main event fairly convincingly, clinching victory with 3 rounds to play. But I'm not going to be talking about that in today's video. Hopefully in a future video, I'll go over some of my more interesting games, but instead in today's video, I want to talk about 2 utterly ridiculous, and you could even say stupidly hilarious things that happened during this tournament. Both of them involved my good friend and veteran expert Eric Goldstein, and both of these situations were unlike anything I'd ever seen play out at a Scrabble tournament, and let's just say they were both so hilarious that I was laughing so hard to the extent I was nearly crying after both of them. And I really hope you guys are going to get just as much of a laugh out of them as I did. The first of our 2 absurdities occurred in a game played during the first early bird between Eric and Patrick Beatriz, who's only been playing tournaments for a little bit over a year, but he's already achieved an expert rating, and I expect he's going to continue getting better very quickly. The game opened pretty unexcitingly, at least for Patrick. Holding a rack with 3 I's and a U, he made a wise decision here to exchange 4 tiles, keeping EIR. Eric, with the high-scoring Z, found by far his best play of Zineb, scoring 52 points and jumping out to an early lead. The lead was short-lived, as Patrick draws the blank and many playable bingos. His highest scoring bingos here are tough to see and score 86 points, either Termitic through the I in Zineb on a double-double, or Bratis from the B in Zineb reaching the bottom triple word score. Patrick instead played Titchier through the I in Zineb, scoring 68 points. Eric, with a bit of a vowel shortage, opts for died under the E and the B in Zineb, scoring 24 points. Personally, I don't think this is a great play, as it keeps 2 R's, not really something that you want to do. I might have gone for Dyer in the same spot, scoring 1 less point and opening a potential S-hook with Dyers, but keeping a much more flexible leave. But in any case, died the choice for Eric. Patrick, with a bit of a vowel shortage himself, plays Jawing for 34 points through the I in Titchier, nicely cleaning up his rack. And here, guys, is where the fun begins. Eric, trailing by 26 points, has the Q, but he also has the U to go with it, so he should hopefully be able to offload it for a decent amount of points. And that's exactly what he does, playing quad to the D in died for 34, keeping EPRR, which is certainly not a terrible leave. However, there is a very, very large problem. In Eric's haste to plop down his Q, he accidentally transposes the O and the U, and instead of playing the valid quad, he plays Cowed, Q-O-U-D. So this is, of course, not a word. This is a phony, and Patrick is well within his power to challenge this off the board, leaving Eric with a 0-point turn as well as the dreaded Q still on his rack. However, amazingly, in a huge stroke of luck for Eric, Patrick does not notice. And this play of Cowed, Q-O-U-D, remains on the board. Remember, in Scrabble tournaments, you are allowed to play things that aren't words. It's always your opponent's responsibility to notice and call you out on it and challenge the word off the board. Patrick failed to do that here, and thus this remained on the board. But the fun is far from over, so keep watching. Patrick, again struggling with too many consonants, finds by far his standout play here of Flaxy for 36 points through the A in Jawing. And now Eric, again with just 1 vowel, needs to figure out how to offload some of these consonants. And he does that by playing Sperm, hooking what he believes is quad to make quads, scoring 34 points and keeping the fairly solid NR leave. Now, of course, Cowds is not a word either. But the million-dollar question was whether Patrick would notice the transposition this time after it was pluralized when he didn't notice it originally. A key thing happened here. After Eric set this play down on the board, he announced a score of 35 points. As you guys can see on the screen, that is incorrect. This play, assuming it stays on the board, actually scores 34, not 35. And usually, tournament players, after their opponents announce a score, will double check and make sure the math is right, and if they get something else, they'll neutralize the clock to resolve the discrepancy. And that's exactly what Patrick did here. He counted this play, and after getting the correct 34, he stopped the clock and was like, hey Eric, I think that's actually just 34 points, not 35 as you said. It's important to note that Eric had not yet drawn his tiles at this point. So then the players are picking up the tiles on the board, looking at the bonus squares, doing the math more carefully, and as Patrick is doing that, and as he's picking up the S in sperm, he finally notices cows. And Patrick immediately perks up and he's like, wait, challenge! And you can imagine after that, Eric was completely besides himself. Like, what the heck is Patrick challenging? Remember, Eric this whole time completely thought he had played a valid word. He was blissfully unaware that he had transposed tiles and played cow before. He certainly didn't do that intentionally. So he's like, what's going on here? And then Patrick simply points out QOUDS on the board, and then Eric realizes, and he of course just concedes the challenge without going up to the computer word judge, since both of these guys know as well as anybody that QOUDS is not a valid word. What's deeply ironic about this is that if Eric hadn't miscounted his play of sperm, it probably would have stayed on the board. Patrick himself said after the game that he's almost certain that if he hadn't noticed the addition mistake and spent more time carefully recounting the play, he almost certainly wouldn't have noticed and Eric would have gotten away with a transposition for the second turn in a row. Now, for those of you wondering why Patrick was allowed to challenge after all of this hubbub, that's a fair question, and the reason is because of the important detail I mentioned earlier that Patrick noticed the scoring discrepancy and stopped the clock before Eric had drawn his replacement tiles. In tournament Scrabble, after a player makes a play, their opponent is allowed to either challenge or say hold, preventing the player from drawing replacement tiles until the player has drawn at least one tile out of the bag. Once the player who makes a play has drawn at least one replacement tile out of the bag, their opponent is no longer permitted to challenge. But since Eric had not drawn, Patrick's challenge stood, and cows and sperm came off the board. The game would go on without anything too eventful happening, and Eric would actually win fairly comfortably by a final score of 457 to 332, despite all of these shenanigans after bingoing out with Biggaroon for 80 points. Now, as you guys can probably imagine, both of these players were in somewhat of a state of disbelief after this whole situation unfolded. Eric, because he couldn't believe he would do such a careless thing as play cowed, and Patrick, because he couldn't believe he didn't notice it all the first time and came perilously close to not even noticing the second time. But besides being in a state of disbelief, both of these guys were also in a state of utter amusement. It is certainly not every day you see something like this happen in a high-level tournament Scrabble game, no less. And Patrick and Eric weren't the only two people who were very amused by this whole thing as it happened. The two people playing next to them at the same table happened to be me and fellow expert Peter Schwartzman. And the funny thing is, my game with Peter was not interesting at all. I drew extremely well and ended up winning the game by a huge margin, and by the time Eric played cowed, I was already up by around 200 points. So at that point, Peter and I more or less knew that I was going to win the game, and as such, we both weren't taking so much interest in it. And here and there, we were peeking over at Eric and Patrick's board to see what was going on. And both Peter and I had noticed when Eric initially played cowed. Of course, we couldn't say anything or indicate anything because that would be unethical and potentially give an advantage to Patrick. So we had to do our best to hold in our laughter after it stayed on the board. And we had to work even harder after Eric did it a second time, pluralizing his transposition on the next turn. It took basically everything I had, and I know Peter had to work super hard too to not just burst out laughing after Eric played sperm and cows, and it seemed that Patrick wasn't going to notice. I know I was watching Patrick very intently as he was recounting the play, thinking, is this guy going to notice, or is this going to stay on the board? And as soon as Patrick was like, wait, challenge, Peter and I, with Patrick and Eric, just pretty much burst into uncontrollable laughter. Peter and I even stopped our own clock in our game because we were both laughing uncontrollably for probably a solid 2 minutes and just could not even focus at all on our own game. This was so ridiculous, stupid, and hilarious at the same time. We all had to have a good, fun, shared laugh, even though it was technically a serious tournament Scrabble game. So, that was absurdity number 1. We now are going to move on to absurdity number 2, which arguably is even wilder. Our second absurdity happened in the penultimate game of the main event between Eric and another expert player, Dustin Dean. Now, before I jump into the actual game, some context. I was already gone at this point. As I mentioned earlier, I did extremely well in the main event, and I had clinched victory with 3 rounds to play. The field was odd, so that means every round someone had to sit out or have a bye. Because I didn't have anything to play for at that point, it was determined mutually between myself and the director, Andy, that it made the most sense for me to take the byes in the final 3 rounds so that others who still had something to play for wouldn't have to sit out. But at that point, I didn't have any more games to play, so it didn't really make sense for me to stay at the tournament venue. As such, since I had a 6-hour drive back to Kentucky and didn't want to get home super late, I said my goodbyes and hit the road. Little could I have ever imagined what I missed witnessing in person over the board. Fast forward about 4 hours after I left, well after the main event had concluded, when I'm somewhere in eastern Kentucky on Interstate 64, and I get a call from an absolutely hysterically laughing Eric Goldstein. He's laughing so hard, he's having a hard time even explaining to me what happens, but he indicates that he wants to tell me about something absolutely ridiculous that happened in his penultimate round match against Dustin Dean. And let me just preface, guys, what I'm about to show you with, by the time Eric was somewhere in the middle of his story, I myself was laughing so uncontrollably that I had to pull over to the side of the interstate because I was just laughing so hard I could not safely even focus on the road as I was driving. So I decided it was the best decision for me to pull over, let Eric finish his story, and then resume driving after I had regained my composure a couple of minutes later. So that is just how funny, absurd, and ridiculous this was. Now, with all that context out of the way, let me tell you guys what actually happened. What was so funny that I literally had to pull over on the side of the highway to process? So here we go. Dustin Dean was first, and he had an opening rack of DEEIRWW. Now, the normal thing to do here would be to play something like Weird or Wired, scoring 26 points, and offloading one of his 2 clunky W's. However, Dustin did not do the normal thing here. In fact, what Dustin did is probably the furthest possible thing from normal. He passed his turn. Let me repeat that, guys. He passed. And when I say passed, I don't mean he exchanged or phonied or anything like that. He literally passed. Now, you might be thinking, why on earth did Dustin pass here? And that's a very valid question. As Dustin explained later, he passed because he noticed that if he had an E to play through, he would have an 8-letter bingo. So he passed in hopes that Eric's next play would expose one of the 10 remaining E's, and Dustin could use that to bingo with on his next play. Now, was this a good decision by Dustin? Frankly, it was not. In general, you don't want to pass on the opening turn of a Scrabble game, regardless of what possible letters could give you a bingo. The reason is, your opponent is going to smell a rat, and they're probably not going to give you anything to work with, so they're just going to exchange, and you basically give them a free turn, or multiple turns if you keep passing, to clean up their rack. And you especially don't want to pass when you have high point tiles like 2 W's on your rack, because what can happen is if you pass 3 times and your opponent exchanges or otherwise scores 0 3 times, then the game will end. After 6 consecutive 0 scores, a Scrabble game ends on the spot. And after that, both players subtract from their existing score the total point value of all of the letters on their rack. So if the game were to end after a 6 pass, Dustin would finish this game with a total of negative 14 points. So unless Eric had 14 or more points on his own rack, Dustin would lose this game. Besides that, it's also not a great idea to pass because there's only one specific tile Dustin's hoping for, the E. And especially with the E being such a potent bingo tile, if Eric makes a play, he's going to probably make a very strong effort not to give Dustin an E to work with after Dustin passes, signaling he's hoping for a tile to bingo through. So very often for Dustin, Eric is just going to make a play that doesn't have an E, and Dustin has completely wasted a turn. So I definitely would not recommend passing in this situation, and like I said, I would generally discourage you guys from ever passing on the opening play. If you have a situation where there are a lot of different tiles that will give you an 8, and you really want to try to not make a play, one thing you can think about doing, although I still recommend using this tactic very cautiously, is playing an intentional phony, hoping your opponent challenges it off the board, doesn't think twice, and then gives you the tiles to work with. This is a tactic that Kevin Burbridge once tried against me in an online game, and I made a whole video on it. It actually almost worked. So check out that video if you're interested in what that might look like. I'll link it in the description below. But that is definitely not what I would recommend in this kind of situation when you have two W's and you're just hoping for one specific tile. Here, Dustin almost certainly should have just done something like weird or wired. But in any case, like I said, Dustin passed hoping Eric would give him an E. Well, Eric didn't have an E to give Dustin. And the play here for Eric under normal circumstances is quite obvious. It's caught for 24 points, offloading the troublesome Q as well as unduplicating his A's and his T's, keeping the decent enough leave of A, G, H, T, and seemingly not giving all that much back to Dustin to work with. But these circumstances are far from normal. Dustin has passed on his opening turn, so what does that tell Eric? Well, Dustin is obviously hoping for one or more tiles he can use for an 8-letter bingo. And Eric figured that if Dustin passed, he most likely had a rack that made 8-letter words with a large number of common tiles, and quite possibly many or even all of the 5 vowels. Given how unorthodox it is to pass the opening move of a Scrabble game at the high level, Eric figured that at the minimum, Dustin must be extremely close to a huge number of different bingos. And because of that, Eric here balked at even giving Dustin an A and a T to work with Cot. So Eric sacrificed 24 points here, instead exchanging, keeping AHT scoring 0. Forgoing the 24 points to exchange here seems like the correct decision for Eric, and it's another illustration of why I don't ever really recommend passing on the opening play. You just give your opponent a free opportunity to exchange and groom their rack while you get nothing to work with that you were hoping for in return. So after Eric exchanges, Dustin decides to pass a second time. In for a penny, in for a pound, he decides. Eric draws much better tiles after his exchange, pulling now A-E-E-H-I-S-T. Eric does not have a playable bingo here, but once again, instead of playing something more conventional like E or Hi and giving Dustin vowels to work with, exchanges again. This time he exchanges just one tile, one of his 2 E's, figuring that A-E-H-I-S-T leaves him fairly likely to draw into a 7-letter bingo on his subsequent turn. And this is where things get absolutely bizarre. Dustin now really can't afford to pass again, or one would think. Because if Dustin passes again, then what he has to realize is that if Eric passes or exchanges on his next play, then the game is going to end. And Dustin does not have a low-scoring rack. He's got 2 W's. He's got 14 points worth on this rack. So if the game ends after a 6 pass, Dustin is going to finish the game with negative 14 points. So unless Eric has 14 or more points on his own rack, Dustin is going to lose. And especially after having had 2 turns to freely exchange and offload high-scoring clunkers, it's pretty unlikely Eric is going to have 14 or more points on his rack. So that seems like a very poor gamble to take for Dustin. If Dustin were to do that, he'd either be hoping that Eric happened to have drawn a high-scoring tile on his exchange, or hoping that Eric himself would balk at the prospect of a 6-pass, thinking that Dustin had lower scoring tiles than he actually did throughout all of this passing. It would be an extremely, extremely bold decision here for Dustin. But he does it. He passes for his third consecutive turn, making the fifth consecutive 0 score. So if Eric scores 0 points on this turn, the game will end. And Eric has drawn a T. So if Eric were to pass here, then Eric would have won the game by a final score of -10 to -14. However, that is not what Eric did. Remember, Eric does not know what Dustin has. And as we mentioned earlier, Eric probably figures Dustin has a much more bingo-prone looking rack than something with 2 Ws. Eric probably figures that if Dustin is passing this much, he's probably got mostly, if not exclusively, low-scoring tiles like 1-pointers. So having an H on his own rack, Eric probably thinks that if they go into a 6-pass, Eric, might actually be the underdog, and he doesn't want to take that chance. So Dustin's gambit here, and his bold psychological risk of passing, allowing a 6-pass, worked in the sense that Eric was too scared to go into the 6-pass. But the good news for Eric is that he did draw a bingo, and he played it. Atheist scoring 78 points. But the alert viewer might notice that Eric has misspelled atheist. Atheist is spelled Atheist, but Eric has played Atheist. Was this intentional? Absolutely not. Like I said, Eric did not want to go into a 6-pass. He figured that Dustin had lower scoring tiles than he did, given that he held an H. So this was absolutely not intentional. Just another tile transposition by Eric, a little bit similar to Cowed against Patrick in the previous example we looked at. Now, here's where things get utterly bizarre. Dustin didn't notice, but he can't even challenge if he notices. Because, remember guys, if Dustin challenges, Eric scores 0 for this turn, and that is the 6th consecutive 0. And Dustin at that point will have full knowledge of what's about to happen. If this play comes off the board, then Eric will win the game -10 to -14. So again, I don't believe Dustin noticed the misspelling, but even if he did, he has to allow it to stay on the board if he wants any chance of winning this game. In any event, this stayed on the board, and the good news for Dustin is he got that E he was hoping for all along. And he immediately slaps down Wireweed, scoring 81 points and retaking the lead. However, there's a big problem. One of Dustin's problems is that Eric has drawn a very good rack after his phony bingo of EGINNO blank and is going to be bingoing again. But Dustin's bigger problem is that Wireweed is not a word, and it comes off the board after Eric challenges. Now you're probably thinking, what on earth? Wasn't Dustin specifically hoping for an E so he could play a bingo through it? Well, yes, he was. But he was mistaken that Wireweed was valid. So this whole time, this entire time, we've been talking about this sequence of passes that Dustin was going through. He was passing, hoping for a tile that would give him a bingo that turned out to be phony. Absolutely ridiculous stuff. And it gets even crazier. Eric at this point is just so utterly besides himself and confused. After all of those passes and now seeing Dustin's rack with 2 Ws after challenging off Wireweed, he's like, what is going on here? What kind of sorcery is this? And Eric has a ton of available bingos here, and none of them are super difficult for a player of his caliber. They should all be fairly routine for him to find. But he thinks here for over 10 minutes because he is just so confused and discombobulated. And spending 10 minutes on essentially your second play here of a Scrabble game is unheard of. Remember, you only get 25 minutes for a whole game of tournament Scrabble. So you don't ever really want to spend 10 minutes on a single turn. Maybe sometimes at the end of the game if you have that much time left, but you don't want to spend 10 minutes on turn 2. But that's exactly what Eric does, and despite all of that time, he makes what's frankly a pretty bad play. He sees tokening for 77 points, but he's not sure of the word, so he decides to pass it up. He doesn't see tenening in the same spot, also for 77, and completely misses his highest scoring bingo, the 82-point eloining, through the I in atheist, covering 2 double word scores. Instead, he plays nitrogen through the first T in atheist for only 68 points. So definitely an uncharacteristic mistake for someone of Eric's caliber, but I have to cut him a little slack because I can't imagine what was going through his mind after seeing the ridiculous sequence of events he and his opponent had just been through. And with this play, Eric has taken a 146-0 lead on what is technically turn 9 of this rather absurd game of Scrabble. Now, I'm not going to go through the rest of this game. Eric won fairly handily, but the final ridiculous thing I feel obligated to mention is that neither player noticed the misspelling of atheist for the remainder of the game. And along with that, neither player noticed that the phony spelling of atheist that Eric put on the board takes a front hook, an L. Latheist is indeed a valid word. This would not be a possibility if Eric had spelled atheist correctly. But with atheist misspelled, if either player draws an L, they can form latheist simultaneously with another word on the triple word score, getting a mammoth number of points. Both of the players were completely oblivious to this throughout the entire game, and it wasn't noticed until Eric had told me this story, and a couple minutes after I regained my composure and was back on the highway, just as we were about to hang up, I was like, Eric, wait a second, I just realized something. And he's like, what? I'm like, you know your phony spelling takes a front hook. He's just like, huh? I'm like, Eric, atheist spelled the way you played it takes a front L. And immediately he's just like, oh my goodness. There were definitely some missed opportunities, let's just say, later in this game for both players to score a large number of points, putting an L on that triple word score. It went completely missed. So, yeah, I'm not even sure what else to say here, guys. Just an absolutely comical and ridiculous, and I think it goes without saying, highly suboptimal sequence of events here from both of these two players. But if nothing else, definitely entertaining and laugh-inducing. So I hope you guys got as much enjoyment and amusement out of these two anecdotes as I certainly did. Like I said, I haven't laughed this hard about things that have happened over a tournament Scrabble board in a very long time. So even though it resulted from some highly suboptimal play, I do sincerely thank Eric as well as his opponents, Dustin and Patrick, for providing us some much-needed entertainment. That's about all I have to say for this one, guys. I would say do not use this video as a learning tool on how to play Scrabble. Maybe, if anything, use it as a learning tool on how to not play Scrabble. But I do hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Really appreciate your support. And with that, that's it for this video. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.